When you need a lawyer, how do you find the right one? Contact the Chicago Bar Association.
Whether you've been injured or need a will prepared, whether you're buying a home or starting a business, having the right lawyer is essential. The Chicago Bar Association have lawyers who practice in most areas of law and speak a variety of languages.
Don't leave it to chance. Get a referral to a screened, experienced lawyer. Visit chicagobar.org or call 312-554-2001. The Chicago Bar Association. Se habla español.
Welcome to You and the Law, Chicago Bar Association production focusing on issues of law and policy as a matter of public education. My name is Mike Alkaraki. I am a Chicago Bar member. I practice plaintiff's personal injury and medical malpractice here at Leahy, Hoste, Alkaraki in Chicago. And we have with us a very special guest, Mr. William Nissen, who has truly an illustrious career that's very dynamic, lots of moving parts, and has been very involved in public policy in a number of capacities. And he is here today to speak with us about a variety of aspects related to death penalty, and criminal justice reform, and a variety of issues that he has been intimately involved with, throughout his career and in many capacities. So with that, Mr. Nissen, thank you so much for sharing your time and expertise with us today.
Sure. Yeah, no, happy to be here.
I provided just a little background on you, and I almost wouldn't know where to begin because I'll leave that to you, because everything from serving in the U.S. Navy to your work at Sidley and sometimes when I think of the lawyers who get involved in the public policy stuff and social justice, it's oftentimes consumer lawyers. Not that it's not big law, I mean, it definitely is too. But I tend to see consumer lawyers more frequently. But you're an example of many of sort of a classic big law lawyer who is kind of dove headfirst into the issues of public policy and social justice. So, it's pretty interesting. And I also think it's very good when we get sort of our big law firms mobilized on some of these issues. And I think you've done that in a lot of ways. So with that, if you could provide us what you think might be, relevant for us to understand a little bit of background about you and what you bring to the table on the issues we're going to discuss today.
Sure. Yeah, no, I went to law school after 4 years serving in the Pacific with the U.S. Navy and the destroyer force during the Vietnam War. And then while I was in law school, one of the things I did was I worked for the Massachusetts Department of Correction one summer and part-time during one school year. So that was really my first introduction to the criminal justice system, was doing that. But I was really headed for a career in commercial law, so I didn't really dwell on that so much. But there were some even then there were some interesting policy issues about medical experimentation on prisoners and law libraries for the people in prison that I worked on as part of the chief counsel's office there at the Department of Correction in Massachusetts. But then I spent 43 years at Sidley and Austin law firm in Chicago, and primarily I did commercial. What I did was related to the futures and options industries, and litigation and regulatory work involving those industries. But along the way, I ended up joining the Union League Club and getting involved in policy issues there. And really, probably the first big one I got involved in there was the death penalty, because I had been appointed. Every so often, you get appointed to represent people in prison in civil rights cases by the federal district court in Chicago, and so I did a few of those over the years. But I did have another court appointment, which was to represent John Gacy in his final appeal before the Court of Appeals for the Seventh Circuit. And that was quite an experience. I had no experience with death penalty before that. And I really, I mean, as everyone knows, he was executed. He was in 1994 and was uh, uh, probably the first one to be executed, sort of in a long time in Illinois, because the Illinois government felt he had to go before others went, essentially. And but I learned just from uh, talking to him and working with him, it made me believe that execution was really not necessary or appropriate, even for the person that most people pointed to as being the one that should be executed.
Yeah.
And he was not doing any harm in prison. He had a business where he sold paintings, and he had a lot of friends that would visit him and so forth. Um, but uh, but in any event, at the Union League Club, where I was involved in the Public Affairs Committee, um, it turned out that when Anthony Porter got in the news, and Anthony Porter was, and this was 1999, so this was about 5 years after I represented John Gacy, that Anthony Porter came very close within 2 days of being executed, and then someone else confessed to the murder that he had been convicted of.
Mhm.
And this was the result of work by some students at Northwestern University Journalism School. And so I suggested to the committee we ought to do something on the death penalty, because look at what an issue it is. It started coming out that we had just as many people exonerated the way Anthony Porter was as we had executed. And
Yeah.
these were people that were already convicted and on death row waiting for execution.
Yeah, and I'm gonna
Uh,
stop just for a moment because I want
sure.
to share something, and you got so much there, so I do hesitate to stop you. But
Sure. Go ahead.
I want to share also. We're recording this on MLK Day.
Yes,
He
you're
had some
right.
thoughts.
Yeah.
He had some thoughts on that. A very simple one, and there are many, many things we could point to. Um, and this is sort of a faith-based or everything-based, perspective. The quote is I do not think that God, this is MLK Jr. I do not think that God approves the death penalty for any crime. And I thought of that, and and when we talk
Good.
about Gacy, we're talking about, people's ideas of monstrosity, right?
Right.
So
Right.
extreme versions. So I do not think the quote is, I do not think that God approves the death penalty for any crime. And it goes on, capital punishment is against the better judgment of modern criminology and, above all, against the highest expression of love in the nature of God. He goes on, he pointed out, not unlike how you just identified, that there is not accuracy all the time, right? There are people who are going to, they're whether innocent or at least not deserving of that, there are
Right.
problems in terms of process and factual accuracy. But King also points out that race, had continued to influence who's sentenced to die.
Right.
So I thought it was maybe worth a note to just point out
Sure.
for those philosophical sort of foundations just on MLK Day as we discuss this issue, which I
Yes.
think is properly considered, in the vein of human rights and human dignity
Yeah.
analysis, as it
Right.
relates to the state, especially.
Sure. Sure. And there was a moratorium movement in Illinois at the time that had been going on for a while, and I really got my committee at the Union League Club to recommend to the board of directors, and they accepted our recommendation that the club support the moratorium movement.
And this was
And
at
this was
what period of time are we now?
late 1999.
Right.
And and this was somewhat unusual. It was in the newspapers. USA Today picked it up that a civic club like the Union League Club would come out. We didn't say the death penalty should be abolished for all time. We said we should have the moratorium that was being worked on at the time,
The distinction
where you
would
just
be
stop.
what? Yeah.
The moratorium is you stop because the system's so broken. If it's going to resume, it's got to be fixed.
Right.
And so for until further notice, it ought to be stopped.
Right.
And then lo and behold, in early 2020, I mean early 2000, I'm sorry, um, Governor Ryan went and declared the moratorium.
Right.
And then ultimately there was nobody else executed in Illinois after that time, because in 2003 he commuted all the sentences, and then 2011 it was abolished by statute.
Right.
And
I
so
think that was
that
Governor
was
Quinn, right?
and that was Governor Quinn on the abolition by statute, exactly. So that was really the start of that of the abolition of the death penalty, was that moratorium movement and Anthony Porter.
Yeah.
Um, and so now, if you go more recently, um, I was getting really to the end of my career at Sidley and Austin, and had decided I pretty much wanted to retire from the commercial law business at the end of 2019, and I found out about a program at Harvard called the Harvard Advanced Leadership Initiative. And I applied for that and was accepted, and went there beginning of 2020. And what that program is if it's for people who have finished their primary career but want to have another career going forward to have social impact activities. And so we had a core curriculum for the whole group, and then you could take whatever courses you wanted in the whole university
Right.
that might supplement that. And so, for example, I took one that was both Kennedy School and Divinity School, taught by a former president of the NAACP
Kennedy
who was
School,
both,
is that policy? Is that the
yeah,
policy school?
public policy school, exactly, Kennedy School of Public Policy, uh, and uh, and that it was taught by former president of the NAACP, who was both a lawyer and a preacher. So you got it from both sides.
Sure.
But that was a very valuable course in terms of learning about this area. And I took some in the law school as well, and sociology in terms of inequality in the cities and how that relates to crime. So I took a lot of those courses, and just decided that given the background I had, both with doing some pro bono work at the firm, the Department of Correction work I had done in law school, that I would do work for people that were seeking early release from prison.
Yeah.
And a friend of mine who was the head of the moratorium movement, Bill Ryan, retired social worker, was working on a bill called the Elder Parole Bill, and we're still working on it, trying to get it passed. Bill and I are still working on it together. But I reconnected with him, and so we've worked on that since. And I've taken on a number of individual clients, representing them in clemency, because we have very little way for people to get out of prison early in Illinois.
Mhm.
Parole was abolished in 1978, which I didn't know until I started really looking into this. And so governor's clemency is the main way of somebody getting out early.
Yeah.
There are a couple smaller programs. There's one that only came into effect in 2022, which is called the Joe Coleman Medical Release Process, where an individual who's either medically incapacitated or terminally ill can get released early. And that there's a youth parole that came in, I think in like 2021, but it was prospective so it's only for sentences, or I'm sorry, I believe it was 2019 um, that it came in, but it's been very recent. And it's for people who were very young when they were sentenced, but it only applies prospectively to people sentenced after that date. So it's quite new, and it doesn't pick up people who've been in for a long time, and
Sure.
that allows a parole, because there have been developments in the law in the meantime, which this Supreme Court law that would indicate Miller versus Alabama, which established that people who are young when they commit crimes deserve special consideration in sentencing,
Right.
and that didn't happen at the time that a lot of people were sentenced.
Right.
So 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 I've represented a number of people in those types of cases, and then I've also done sort of in conjunction with the Joe Coleman work. I've done a couple chancery cases where um, both seeking writs of mandamus against the Illinois Prisoner Review Board, where I felt that they weren't following the law in terms of their process.
Hmm.
One being not to require people who are turned down to wait for 3 months when they're terminally ill to file a new petition. Um, and the other one was to give an explanation as to why they're turning somebody down,
Right.
as opposed to just saying denied.
Right.
And we're continuing to do the elder parole work. In terms, we've got a new bill. It's called Senate Bill 86, which was just filed about a week ago for this new session. And we've got a coalition of organizations that have been with which is being coordinated at the Union League Club to advocate for the bill.
Great. I want to kind of pick up a couple,
Oh, sure.
well,
Go
maybe
ahead.
one theme and then kind of connect it to something.
Sure.
I don't know how to conceptualize it yet, but um, certainly, well, this is always present in our practice, and I feel like it's always going on. But the idea that of lawyers not just as technicians,
Right.
but as engineers and architects, and that's when we get into policy. And then
Right.
not every
Right.
lawyer has to be an architect. That's
Right.
true. But I think there's a consciousness now, and I can give you some kind of concrete examples um, of that dynamic. What are we as lawyers?
Right.
Are we, because we want to avoid this thing where we're like thoughtless mercenaries, and I don't think
Right.
we are. I don't think we
No.
are. And I think that the practice has built up infrastructure to protect against that in some ways. But that dynamic is always present in some ways, and it runs into our zealous advocacy and our
Right.
self-consciousness of what we're doing. But there's for sure, in my career, and I'm about 20 years into it now, I have certainly seen um, a drive for lawyers to be more conscious, not just, of our litigation goals or the goals of our matter, but how they fit into the larger practice and how the larger practice or the concept of rule of law fits into what we might call, liberal democracy, or however you want to phrase it, one that is
Sure.
based on, the inherent dignity of the individual in large part. So I,
Right.
I think that's sort of one of the, or perhaps the sort of, um, thread that runs through, I think, everything we do in some sense, whether we're thinking about it or not. So, one of the things that's kind of occurred, and I've been a part of this, like even at Loyola Law School where I went, there's a professional identity formation course, which is all about being conscious of the manner in which policy and law impacts. Like, what's the result? Does it impact different groups of people differently? And one of the things that you had mentioned, and I don't want to do too much talking because we want to hear from you, but one of the books that was part of that course was this book called The Color of Law by Richard Rothstein, which was very much about um, purposeful segregation throughout our country through mortgages in the house and basically housing discrimination. So that's maybe a classic example
Right.
that opens up to so many of the issues, including some of the criminal justice reform issues that you're dealing with. So I did too much talking there, and I apologize, but there's a
Well,
lot there that you're doing work on.
sure.
So with that theme, and also you mentioned Union League Club, and also you
Yeah.
mentioned the Harvard leadership program. Can you share how those two organizations fit into you bringing these ideas into reality?
Sure. I mean, in terms of the Harvard program, I mean, I did a lot of reading, and as I said, took courses in the area, and that's where I really the part of the program is you develop a project going forward. as you leave, a social impact project. How are you going to use this opportunity we've given you to study at Harvard, post career, to have social impact? Because that's what we want.
Sure,
That's what we want the program for, is to
sure.
develop people to use their talents. And so I developed the project I developed was to work on the elder parole bill and also to have these individual representations as an adjunct, because there there's a man, lawyer, Brian Stevenson, with the Equal Justice Initiative in Alabama, and actually our firm did death penalty cases in Alabama in conjunction with his program, the Sidley, and he came up and met with us, and I did one of those cases in Alabama for a death penalty defendant. But he talks about proximity, and I took that word really to be, not just to try and get policy passed, but get to know the people who the policy will impact, and that's the proximity part. And that's what I found so valuable about representing individual people, because I learn their individual stories. I learn about what types of representations they've had, which sometimes is not the greatest in terms of how they end up where they end up. Not that they're innocent necessarily. I would say most of the clients I've worked with were guilty and certainly admitted at this stage, but just in terms of the sentence they got, for example,
Hmm.
with other decisions or other representation, they may have done better.
Sure,
Um,
sure.
and 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 they're and they clearly don't have the means to do the types of things that big corporations can do in terms of the legal proceedings they get involved in.
Sure.
And so and so part of it is what I'm trying to do is maybe help remedy some of that on the back end,
Right.
um, and develop that. And we've done a lot of this at the Union League Club. We did, during that period when death penalty hadn't been abolished yet, but had been stopped with the moratorium. We did do a number of death penalty reforms. We took a position on a bill which was passed, which allowed for depositions in capital cases, and that made a difference when people still tried capital cases after the moratorium because the law was still there, but ultimately nobody got executed.
Right.
Um, and the club has been very good about. It's got a public affairs committee which goes to the beginning of the club in 1879.
Yeah.
And I was club president 2017 to 18,
Right.
and we've always prided ourselves on getting involved in the community. We say commitment to community and country
Right.
is an unofficial motto of the club, and so
Sure.
we've got a currently administration of justice subcommittee, and we're going to do a program on immigration coming up. We're going to do a program on an individual that was released after being turned down for parole for like 30 years.
Sure.
And there's a new film out, documentary film on that called In Their Hands. And we're going to do a program on that in
That's
early February. So we do bring people in to speak to club members and invite, and that's actually what the CBA is co-sponsoring that particular program.
yeah. That's
Um,
great.
and
That's
so,
great.
yeah, we like to, get involved in the public arena.
Great. So we have probably a few more minutes, maybe close to 5 more minutes. And in that time, I certainly want to get to HB 2045, which is active work you're doing right now, if I'm not
Well,
mistaken.
it's now SB 86
Excuse me,
because
you're
of
right. Thank you.
the
Thanks
new
for
session.
that, sir. Yes. So I'd like to get to that because that's ongoing business.
Yes,
And then
yes.
also, and we've touched on this a little bit, but just I'm just thinking about the civic, the civics ethic that runs through everything you just said, really.
Yeah.
And maybe, if you feel comfortable, I mean, if you can kind of share just some just basics in terms of like orientation type ethics, not ethics in terms of rules, but sort of like orientation, feeling, spirit about, how should lawyers be thinking about policy, because we do in general, we focus on our cases, but I
Right.
think it's also embedded in the rules and beyond that, the culture of
Right.
the law that we're supposed to, if we're really going to actualize our
Sure.
potential
Yeah.
as lawyers, that we have
Right.
to have our head on a swivel and paying attention to what's going on and be relating those to basic civics,
Right.
you know.
Right. Sure. Well, so for SB 86, which is the current version of our bill, what it would provide would be for anybody who's 55 years or older and has served at least 25 consecutive years in prison to have an opportunity to be paroled. They would get a hearing. It wouldn't guarantee that they would get out, but it would give them a hearing where the parole board, which is the prisoner review board, would decide whether or not they were ready to get out.
Yeah.
And this would start to introduce the concept of parole back into into Illinois, and counter some of the what I would view as overly aggressive um, laws that have come into play in the last couple of decades, in terms of punishment versus rehabilitation.
Mhm.
Um, and it would start out small. There would be about 1,000 people in this category out of about 30,000 that are in the system now. So it wouldn't overwhelm the system, and it would be those who are the most expensive to house in prison, because many of these people are in walkers. Some use oxygen. They're in wheelchairs. They have to have things done for them. I mean, in my mind, there's no reason for people like that to have to be locked up. Uh, and uh, and just in terms of the policy question you asked, yeah, I think as lawyers, we have a unique privilege to be able to practice law. I just find that to be a real privilege, that we're entitled to, start lawsuits. We can issue summons, subpoenas. The public trusts us,
Right.
and it seems to me a lot of the issues we see really do have broader implications. And by practicing and getting involved in policy, the two can feed on each other. It seems to me that being more aware of the policy can help inform the arguments you make on behalf of clients, and working with clients can very much inform the policy. And you can see where reforms are needed or improvements needed just through representing clients, and seeing what has happened to them in the system, and how might the system be better.
Perfect.
And so I think I think it is a responsibility of lawyers at least to be thinking about that.
Thank you very much. And as we conclude here, because we are about out of time, it does move fast. Can
Yeah.
you share any resources, whether a website or otherwise, for the public to get to be more attuned to what you're working on right now with this elder parole bill?
Right. We have a website called elderparole.org. Very simple.
Great. Perfect.
And it has resources on it. So and you can sign up to get notifications from time to time when there are developments. So I encourage people to go to elderparole.org.
Perfect. Well, Mr. Nissen, thank you very
Yeah,
much
thank you.
for being here.
Sure.
And
No, I appreciate it.
thank you to our audience for tuning in to this episode of You and the Law. We appreciate it. Take care.